Good morning. One of the most challenging and potentially destructive threats posed by social media these days to individuals, organizations, some argue to democracy itself, is fake news. Here's a case study in how fake news can affect schools. A public school district found itself entrapped in a lie after a TikTok user posted falsely that the district had forced COVID-19 vaccinations on students during a school day. That misinformation was driven to tens of thousands of people by an InfoWars segment in which a man contacted the far right conspiracy theory news website to claim that his brother's daughter, who attends the schools, was vaccinated against her will and told not to tell her parents. The district immediately attempted to correct the misinformation, including pointing out that the date of the alleged forced vaccinations occurred before the school year had even begun. There was nobody in the schools on that day. Nevertheless, false reports and speculation continued, particularly on social media, and the school district expended considerable time and effort trying to beat back the false reports. We got involved in Hennis many months into this, by the way, and we conducted a social media threat analysis, ended up advising the school district to proceed cautiously in the short term, given that much of the conversation locally about this had died down and now was concentrated among people living far outside the district. Longer term, our recommendations included building a standing page on the district website to correct the misinformation. For example, Marion County Public Schools in Ocala, Florida, for years has maintained a rumor control page on the district website. The heart of the page is a fact sheet that quickly describes rumors circulating in the school community and answers those with facts. Klein Independent School District outside Houston, Texas, was facing a constant stream of misinformation and misstatement of fact from a community Facebook page. They started what they call the transparency page on their website, and it features this FAQ, which they update on a regular basis and use both to answer legitimate questions and to set the record straight by converting the circulating misinformation into a question, which they then answer with facts. We've also recommended that districts consider starting a media or news literacy program for students and parents. You may already have news literacy programs for your middle and or high school students. If so, good for you, and we urge you to communicate about those classes to your community. If not, you don't need another task, but we'd urge you to consider adopting this practice. A study conducted by the Stanford History Education Group found that preteens and teenagers are technically savvy and spend enormous amounts of time online, like we needed a study to know that, right? But most fail at assessing the veracity of news articles, images, and other online content. Nonprofit group Media Literacy Now reported that media literacy is the literacy of the 21st century. Numerous outlets offer schools help with this effort, including that Stanford History Education Group, Media Literacy Now, the Poynter Institute, and more. State of Illinois passed a law requiring news literacy be taught in public high schools as of the 2022-2023 school year. We are all suffering from the results of a lack of media literacy in our society. I would argue that schools can seize a leadership role in this. Arm your students to be savvy consumers of online content. Tell your school community about it. Think about offering news literacy training to parents as well. If you extend that kind of essential training to them through, for instance, what some public school districts have called a parent university approach, I think it will be timely, ultimately helpful to your district, and I believe very popular in your community. We also recommend that, given this onslaught of fake news, districts have to really regularly amp up communications to help inoculate yourselves against a revival of any false information. That district I talked about earlier survived, of course, but it was a sobering lesson on the power of fake news or false information and how it can literally come out of nowhere. I'm Tom Flatting, as Scott said. I'm the managing partner at Hennis Communications. We're a Cleveland-based crisis communications and reputation management firm. We're also a partner to the Ohio School Boards Association. I've been with Hennis for 9 years. For the 33 years prior, I was in news. I was most recently managing editor of the Plain Dealer in Cleveland. I was also managing editor of the Akron Beacon Journal and the Detroit Free Press, and I was editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota. Here's a fact about what seems like this recent phenomenon. Fake news is not new news. Fake news has existed virtually since humans began to communicate. In the case of the United States, it's existed before we were the United States. Consider this guy. In 1769, John Adams wrote in his diary that he'd spent the evening in a curious employment, cooking up paragraphs, articles, occurrences, etc., working the political engine. Adams, along with his cousin Sam and other Boston patriots, was planning false and exaggerated stories to undermine British authority in Massachusetts. Then there was this guy. In 1782, working on a homemade printing press in a Paris suburb, Benjamin Franklin created an entirely fake issue of a real Boston newspaper, the Independent Chronicle. One of the fake stories reported that American forces on the New York frontier had discovered bags containing more than 700 scalps, bags of scalps from soldiers, boys, girls, even infants, all allegedly taken by Indians in league with King George. Franklin reported that a note from the Indians to King George found with the bag said he hoped he'd enjoy these presents and be refreshed. Franklin sent copies of the fake newspaper to colleagues, and guess what? The story appeared in legitimate newspapers in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York, and Rhode Island. Now, the author of the piece I used, and I mainly used in researching this, he's a professor named Robert Perkinson. He goes on to point out that this really didn't swing the Revolutionary War. By 1782, the war was largely over and won by the revolutionaries. It did, however, have a lasting influence on how the people of the new nation regarded Native Americans. The main difference today, of course, with that long ago time when our country was first being founded is speed. It took Franklin months to spread his fake news. Imagine how long it took just to get copies of his fake paper from Paris to the colonies. Fake news today spreads in seconds. And the most efficient channels have proven, of course, to be social media, particularly X, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat. The technology we use to communicate today obviously is very different from even 10, 15 years ago. But it's telling, and I think it's instructive, to consider how many of the conditions that have laid fertile ground for fake news are similar, even when they're separated by more than 100 years. Technology changes, human nature doesn't, said David Mikkelson. He's editor of the famed fact-checking site Snopes.com. People want to believe the same things for the same reasons and spread the same kind of stories. It's just, instead of talking over their back fence, they're on Facebook. Fake news went by a different name in the early part of the last century. It was called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism was born in the mid-1890s, early 1900s. Think about this. Then, suddenly, printing presses became affordable. Price of paper, newsprint, craters. To use the economic term, barriers to entry came down, and newspapers began popping up everywhere. Now, there's virtually no cost to being a publisher and getting your news in front of potentially thousands of readers or more at the push of a button. Everyone is potentially a journalist. Everyone carries a video recording device. Back then, Joseph Pulitzer, the famed publisher and namesake of the Pulitzer Prize, dropped the price of his paper to 2 cents per issue. Now, news is free on the internet. New York City alone back then had 15 English language newspapers and numerous others for recent immigrants in their native language. The competition for attention between the many media outlets was fierce. What resulted? Increasingly sensational stories that sometimes were what we would call today fake news. Spanish-American War of 1898 is one of the classic examples. Historians now, they kind of dismiss the notion that yellow journalism and the newspaper war being waged between Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, the publisher of the New York Journal, caused the real war between Spain and America. But both publishers printed stories giving credence to rumors about how the USS Maine was sunk, which was the triggering event for the war. And Hearst was famed or infamous for saying war makes for great circulation. We are now, I believe, living through a second yellow journalism era. The advances of technology and the speed with which we now communicate has made this a golden era for fake news. What should we do? What can we do? Well, I'd suggest we all begin, and particularly people in positions like yours, leaders of school districts, people who are determining what schools should do and how they should deal with this. I think we should all begin by taking a step back and thinking about how we get information. Analyze your own social media habits. For better or worse, most people now are getting news on social media, and that has been now the case for years. In December 2018, the Pew Institute reported that for the first time in its history, social media had exceeded print media as a primary news source. Just 16% of respondents, and that's lower now, I'm sure, 16% of respondents said they depend on print media like old-fashioned newspapers for news. That was behind social media, which got 20%. In 1996, for comparison's sake, by the way, the Pew study showed 72% of people surveyed read a newspaper daily. Only 12% were going online for news. Obviously, in 1996, there were a lot fewer online news outlets, and we hadn't trained people to go there. Even as they regularly turn to social media for news, a majority of Americans, 57%, who often get news on social media, say they expect the news they see on those platforms to be largely inaccurate. Concerns about the inaccuracies in news on social media are prevalent, even among those who say they still prefer to get their news there. I have no explanation for that. Although I'll tell you that when I was still a newspaper editor and I saw research like that, it made me want to go play in traffic. Facebook dominates the conversation. About 4 in 10 Americans, 43%, get news on the site. Let's think about Facebook. Most of us friend people who are like us on Facebook. We follow people whose posts we enjoy and agree with on X. We read, listen to, and watch the news outlets that reflect the views and beliefs we already hold. So, in analyzing your social media habits, how and where you get news, ask yourself if your opinions are being tested. Now, let's say you want to be a smarter consumer of news. You want to challenge your own opinions, and most of all, you want to be able to recognize fake news. First and foremost, let's acknowledge that there are not clear boundaries, and there often aren't easy ways to quickly distinguish what's fake and what's not. University of Minnesota law professor William McEverin told the American Bar Association Journal this: it is extremely difficult to define in a clear way the boundary between fake news and alternative viewpoints. You may know it when you see it, but it is a danger to impose limits on speech. Let's also realize that we are not drowning in a sea of fake news. A Science Advances study reported that not even 0.1% of the content people see is fake news. At the same time, though, while fake news is not large in volume, it is outsized in potential influence and damage. MIT researchers a few years ago published a massive study in Science that analyzed every contested news story in English across the first 10 years of Twitter's, what was then known as Twitter's, existence. Here's a quick summary of that research. Fake news and false rumors reach more people, penetrate deeper into the social network, and spread much faster than accurate stories. As the Atlantic magazine put it in reporting on the study, a false story reaches 1,500 people 6 times quicker on average than a true story does. Let's also realize that the cries about fake news have served to delegitimize real news, particularly news that reports critically about people or issues. So I'm going to argue that it's important to understand fake news, to recognize when it's not fake, and to work to stop the spread of fake news. And for your schools and your school districts, what's on the line is your most important uninsured asset, your reputation as school leaders, as school districts. Let's talk about some guidelines that anyone can follow, we can follow. Start by being willing to challenge your own beliefs. If you find yourself recoiling from a story or a news report, ask yourself if that's because it's unbelievable or that you don't want to believe it. If your emotional buttons are hit, you're less likely to deploy critical thinking skills, so recognize that. There also are established best practices for recognizing fake news. Here's some I've collected from a variety of what I consider to be reliable sources, including the New York Public Library. If it's supposed to be a story from a news website, does the web address appear real with no spellings or odd domains? I mean, this sounds basic, this sounds simple, but people every day overlook it. .co is a common tip-off. They're defunct now, but two common fake news sites parading as legitimate for years, for example, were abcnews.com.co and bloomberg.ma. One of the most common examples of fake news on social media are the misuse of pictures from one event to illustrate a false point. There are tools, and they are free, such as Google reverse image search, to check where an image originated and whether it has been altered. When I was an editor, some of my favorite questions from my reporters about their sources was, how did your sources come to know that? How and why are your sources in a position to know that? Did they hear it? Did they see it? Do they have paper records corroborating it? I'd urge you to ask similar questions when reading and assessing news stories. Are the people being quoted or cited in this story in a position to know what they're saying? And are they putting their names behind what they're saying? Admittedly, sadly, in my opinion, that guideline's trickier. In a perfect world, everyone quoted, all sources would provide their names, their titles. This is far from a perfect world. I hated unnamed sources when I was a journalist, but they become a way of life, particularly in Washington, D.C., where you might have trouble getting someone to tell you on the record that the sky is blue. So look for other clues when a reporter is using unnamed sources. Is that reporter in the story providing a reason that the source can't be named? And there may be legitimate reasons. People could lose their jobs, their safety could be imperiled. Is the reason included, and does it ring true in this case? Does the reporter say the unnamed source's information is somehow corroborated? Ideally on paper, but at least by other sources, who unfortunately may also demand to be unnamed. This is a crucial one. What information is the unnamed source imparting? Is it a fact that can be checked somewhere else? Beware, especially, an unnamed source making a personal attack or criticizing some issue or other person. At my newspapers, and this was back in the day, it was a long time ago, I will admit, but we simply didn't allow that. That's not a fact that sheds light on an issue. That's an opinion about another person. And you should be willing to put your name behind a critical opinion of someone else. One of my favorite editors used to say, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. It means, of course, believe nothing without checking it out. And we have a question. Yes, please. We have a question in the chat.
I don't see one, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we'll keep going and there will be time at the end for questions, but feel free to interrupt me with questions as well. Saying this means believe nothing without checking it out. Now, you don't have time, or I'm sure inclination to check out every fact and every story. But if the theme or central point of the story seems off to you, there are places you can check. Among the most reliable and popular fact checking sites are Snopes, PolitiFact, and ProPublica. We can also all play a role, all of us can play a role, I believe, in stopping or at least limiting the impact of fake news, particularly on social media. Stop for a moment before you share or retweet. Have you checked out that the story you're about to share is true or legitimate? Have you asked yourself, why am I deciding to tell other people? When you're reading fake news, take time to absorb the news. News comes at us today like a blizzard or a hurricane. That doesn't mean you have to consume it that way. A study from early 2020, which The Guardian reported on, which was conducted by researchers from MIT and the University of Regina in Canada, speaks to the dangers of our distracted world when it comes to consuming news. Sorry about that. The two conventional wisdom theories are that people who share fake news do so because they aren't very bright, they're gullible, they believe the stories are true, or that they're cynical jerks. They're focused on slandering the opposition, don't care if they're not true. But the Canadian psychologist Gordon Pennycock and his colleagues found evidence that most people prone to sharing fake news do think it's important to share only true stories and are capable of detecting fabricated ones. It's just that they get distracted by, among other things, the urge to share the story they're reading before they've had a proper chance to reflect on a story's legitimacy and veracity. Put most simply, in our frantic world, slow down. One of the most common ways fake news is spread is when people share a story without realizing it's from months or even years ago and either no longer is true or doesn't apply to anything happening today. Internet news naturally always sounds like it's happening right now. Here's an example from Slate at how this can go bad. In January 2019, a local TV station said law enforcement was looking for a human trafficking suspect around Waco, Texas. A radio station employee summarized the story with a more urgent headline: suspected human trafficker, child predator may be in our area, and posted it on Facebook. The writer had a legitimate concern. He wanted to raise local awareness about a criminal on the loose. Instead, unfortunately, the story got out of control. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times across the country, likely by users who thought our area referred to their town instead of Texas. The suspect was apprehended soon after the initial report in January 2019, and the article was updated. But people kept sharing the original post for weeks because it sounded scary and urgent, and they didn't check to see where the danger was and if the danger was gone. Okay, here's another check. There are really big stories that one media outlet has alone, but they're rare. They're really rare. If you see a story, see who else is reporting on it. If it's no one, your eyebrows should go up a little higher. Be cautious before you share that story. We'll quickly go to this and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Confirmation bias, social science phenomenon that has been around for years. Basically, it's a tendency to gravitate to information that confirms your beliefs while ignoring contrary information, regardless of the facts. With complex issues, including news stories, and with the power of social media to spread information in an instant, confirmation bias can be gasoline for the fake news fire. So, how do we get out of this? Do we get out of this? Fake news is not going to go away or even start to fade away easily, in part because fake news can be quite effective in pushing a point of view, and in part because our dedication to protect free speech also protects the purveyors of fake news, and that's a legitimate concern. We do know, though, who helped end the earlier era of yellow journalism, and it was us. It was readers, the people who buy and consume the news. There was some very fine journalism done during the yellow journalism era. Scandals were exposed. The Jungle, which was Upton Sinclair's classic book, led directly to the passage of the Pure Few Drugs Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Watchdog stories chased corrupt politicians like Boss Tweed out of office. Over time, because readers demanded better news, the news got better. Readers and journalists figured it out. Sensationalism faded. Civil rights reporting, the 50s Vietnam, the 50s, the Vietnam War reporting, the 60s, Watergate in the 70s followed. An era that often is cited by people today who don't like the current media atmosphere and say they wish it was more like back then. It happened because the profession responded to readers' desire for more serious news they can trust. We're starting to see this happen now. We've seen more collaboration across platforms, newspapers working with TV or radio on projects, for example. We've seen more journalists embracing the power of multimedia, engaging more readers on important stories. We've seen the rise of new journalism outlets on a national and local basis that now are years old, like Politico, like ProPublica. It's not coincidence that this fake news issue has risen and public trust in media has declined simultaneous with many media outlets shutting down and most facing the toughest economic times in more than a century. As with so many things, when it comes to fake news versus real news, you're going to get what you pay for. So if we demand legitimate news and are willing to pay for it, that will help stop the era of fake news. For school districts, the best weapons against fake news are still, I believe, truth and facts, but you have to communicate them quickly, decisively, and often. All right. With that, I am going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions. Please feel free. Unless, of course, I've answered every possible question about fake news, and you're now armed with how to guard against it and stop it.
And you should be able to unmute yourself if you do want to ask that question live versus putting it into the chat for our guests today.
You're also welcome to contact me. Of course, my email is my last name, Flatting, @crisiscommunications.com. I should mention that Hennis has a free twice monthly newsletter. We will not sign you up for it. You have to request it. You can request that by emailing me or by contacting Hennis at crisiscommunications.com. We are a partner, as I mentioned, of OSBA, and an initial consultation with us is free. How do you identify fake news in a timely way? Well, there's a couple of ways, actually. First of all, some of those tips that we were talking about can help. Is anybody else reporting it? And if so, who? Let's give it the most basic logic test. Does it sound like this is news that rings true to you? Who else is sharing it? Where are you seeing it? What are the sources for it? And are those sources in a position to know? But timeliness is really key for schools and school districts. If you are attacked with false information, misinformation, I believe you should not allow misstatements of fact to live on. I don't think you should correct them on social media because it's become such a toxic place. My advice would be to use a controlled environment like your website, like those examples we saw from Texas and Florida, where people are using their websites to correct misinformation. It's not easy. But over time, we have seen with those districts that they have taught their communities, if they hear something about their schools or school districts that doesn't seem like it could be true, or it seems like it could be false or fake news, they now go to those websites to check it out. And on an ongoing basis, it has helped those schools and school districts to get the facts out, to communicate with their communities. Anything else? We have 1 minute left. 1 minute left, right, Scott?
Yes, we do. Have you used Ground News or an aggregator as a fact checker? Do you recommend that?
Yes, I do. I have, and I do. It is a good fact check service.
or at least it's a balance, or it shows where your news is coming from, the right, left, center, rather than just a fact checker versus Snopes. I would,
Right. Right. All right. Listen, I appreciate y'all taking the time out. I know how busy you are, taking the time out of a busy morning to sit in on this. As I said, please feel free to contact me at any point. I'm happy to follow up with you. I'm also happy to share this PowerPoint should you want it. And Scott, as he said, has made it available. Oh, we have one question.
sorry.
Addie?
Oh,
Oh, Scott, they're looking for that last service you mentioned.
yeah, I just put it into the chat. It's called Ground News.
Ground News.
Like you grind coffee. I think is where that comes from. And then Snopes, we use that, and Associated Press, that kind of places for fact checks.
ProPublica also is a good source for fact checking.
There you go.
All right.
Great.
Thank
Awesome.
you all very,
Thank
very
you guys
much.
all.